Every country will undergo a structural transformation. Virtually everyone has to change in some ways. Some will find it easier, others much more difficult. There is no long-term future for coal. That's the bottom line. And it's a question of the time frame for phasing it out. The sooner we phase it out, the better.
All of us know him as the former governor of the Bank of England. He's today the UN Special Envoy for Climate and Finance. Garnering the finance industry's response and commitments to the climate change agenda and preparation for the COP26 meeting that is going to take place in Glasgow at the end of this year in November. Also, because he works with the network of central banks and supervisors, I wanted to get a sense in terms of how the finance sector is preparing for its own commitments to the climate change agenda. But we had a wide-ranging conversation. We talked about cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies. His views are actually very well known in other videos, in other conversations he's had. But I wanted to test him on his idea of the architecture of central bank digital currencies and where the bridges are with cryptos as they are evolving right now. In preparation for this conversation that I had with Mark Carney, I also came across the fact that he just published a book called Values. So I asked him a little bit about that and tested a couple of ideas from an emerging market perspective. So here is the conversation.
Emmanuel, first, thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of the Asian Banker, so I appreciate the conversation. In two respects. One was when I was governor, one of the responsibilities as governor of the Bank of England, at least, is you oversee the insurance industry, Lloyd's of London. They're very good at managing climate risk because they have tremendous climate exposure. So you naturally develop some expertise there. And then with the run-up to the Paris Accord, we helped develop the TCFD and other tools, including very important work with the PBOC. Launch of the Network for Greening the Financial System is one of the co-founders with them and the Banque de France of that. So I was active in it as governor, but to the specifics, just as my term was coming to the end, the UK was assuming the presidency of the COP. So this was last year. And I was asked by the Secretary General and the Prime Minister Johnson, to help with the private finance agenda. So this is focusing on, I really think your viewership and readership, private banks, insurance companies, pension funds, et cetera, globally, and organizing the system so that it has the information, the tools, and the markets they need to manage climate risk. Now, I'll tell you one last thing, which is that when I agreed to do this, it was back in January, February of last year, and I thought, well, I'll be doing it until the end of the year, which was the original timing for COP. As it turns out, it's pretty much a full-time job, and I've been doing it since then, and I'm grateful for it. But it's been longer than I expected.
And you're doing it pro bono. That's the interesting part. So you must be paying for a past sin somewhere.
Exactly.
And a lot has happened since the previous meeting, and now in preparation for COP26, working up to the agenda and so on. And then there was the US, getting out of the deal of the Paris Accord and then getting back in. And President Biden had this global climate summit this year.
Yes.
So just bring us up to speed in terms of what the preparation is for COP26, and the issues that you've been assigned to cover, finance, the private sector. What are the top of mind issues that you're dealing with leading up to the November meeting?
The overall objective of COP26 is to keep that 1.5 degree target that was set at Paris within reach, so that ambitious country objectives and programs, so-called NDCs, that when we bring them all together, we look at and we say that the world still has a chance to reach 1.5 degrees. There's other major country level issues to be sorted out. But as you say, Emmanuel, I'm focused on the private finance side. And our objective for that is, I would say, twofold. The first is to make sure that financial institutions, whether they're banks or sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, have the information, the type of climate disclosure that they need, that they have the tools, which would include scenarios for stress testing and assessing whether an asset or a company is on a path towards net zero or not, and if so, what are the risks being run, and that they have markets, and that means new markets like a market for carbon offsets, as an example, a true global professional market, $100 billion a year type market, not a niche amateur market as it is at present. So the part of the job, part of what we're doing is working with the private sector, and it's a global effort. There's a series of working groups. There's thousands of people working on these issues to develop exactly that. That agenda is making tremendous progress. We've just had a G7 meeting, which has agreed to have mandatory disclosure. We have the IFRS, which is developing climate disclosure. We have Bill Winter's work on carbon offsets that's moving forward, et cetera. So all of that. The second big thing we're doing, though, is getting commitments from financial institutions themselves to manage their portfolio consistent with what the governments are doing. If governments are committing to net zero, and that is the case now for covering 70% of global emissions. But when I took on this role, it was only 30% of global emissions were covered by net zero commitments. So you bring the two together, you have a situation where financial decisions will take climate change into account. The information will be there, the tools, the markets to express those views, and financial institutions themselves will be making judgment about who is part of the solution and who's still part of the problem, and allocating capital accordingly. And if I may say, in the process of doing that, and I think this is increasingly understood, not just managing risk, but creating tremendous value. This is an enormous commercial opportunity that is really developing.
Commercial opportunity. Let's get back to that phrase along the way. One of the interesting things about talking with you as a governor of a central bank, now dealing with climate change and how it's going to be applied in financial services, there's this whole dimension of the finance industry, banks, insurance companies, asset management companies, and in many jurisdictions, and including the UK where you were governor, they're regulated by banking regulators and so on. There's the capital market aspect to it. There's the ground level lending business. Give me a sense of the conversations that you've been having with governors of central banks, just generally, but also specifically in the large countries like China. I'm here in Beijing, and then in India, and then some of the leading regulators like Singapore, Hong Kong, maybe the UAE. What's the flavor of the conversations? What's the level of commitment? And what are some of the issues, difficulties that they are facing?
That's a great question. So the first thing is, if we go back 5.5 years to the Paris Accord, just after that, there was a group formed with the People's Bank of China, Bank of England, Banque de France, Netherlands, a few others, but 8 central banks formed a group called the Network for Greening the Financial System. And the objective was to develop the tools and the expertise to manage climate-related risks. So to do our jobs as bank supervisors and with our responsibilities for macro-prudential risks and financial stability, to address those risks around climate, and to help the private sector do their job to develop that expertise. Fast forward to today, there are 90 central banks that are members of that group, covering 85% of global emissions. So the core of the whole of the global central banking community and supervisory community coming into that, including People's Bank of China, obviously a founder, the Reserve Bank of India, the MAS in Singapore, Bank of Japan, et cetera, the Asian central bank and authorities, the JFSA as well in Japan. So front and center on this. And so the conversation among central bankers is very practical. It is very focused on understanding the risks related to climate, which Of course, there's one class of risk, which are physical risks, unfortunately, which we're being hit with, and the impact on property and supply chains, others. But the second and the biggest form of the risk is transition risk. What happens as we move towards solving this issue? Which assets are stranded? Which companies profit, but which companies are made less competitive? And are banks ready for that? One of the big things that has been done, and as we sit down to talk this week, it's just come out, is that grouping of central banks has released climate scenarios. 4 climate scenarios. They're global scenarios. They drop down to the major country level. They drop down by the sector level for companies. And they can be used, and they're intended, and they will be used by banks and financial institutions to help manage their risk, understand their risk over a 10-year, 20-year horizon as we move, or not, because we could move towards net zero in less than 2 degrees, or we could basically be on a business as usual path. And I think from a risk management perspective, board, senior managers, that's what you want to understand, and then position yourself accordingly. So the short answer to your question is very practical, very focused discussions. And the other point I would make is that very broad-ranging discussions as well, because it's also about central bank operations, their own risk on their own balance sheet, their own disclosure around that, and we will see more and more of that in the years to come.
And how's the U.S. The Federal Reserve Bank system involved in it? How have they come on board? I noticed that Larry Summers made a comment just a few weeks ago saying that pandemics are more important than climate change at this point. So what's the tone and what's the engagement level with the Federal Reserve Bank system?
The Federal Reserve Bank has joined the Network for Greening the Financial System. They joined just at the turn of the year, so very welcome that they're engaged there. All central banks have ranges of responsibilities. So the Bank of England, very broad range of responsibilities. The Fed, a little more narrow, and so they address it accordingly. But let me address that comment. I mean, of course, immediately the major issue is to vaccinate. I have to say, Emmanuel, I'm not going to come up with the next vaccine. I'm not going to be able to vaccinate anybody. I'm not qualified to do it, nor is any central banker qualified to manage any of that. Of course, central bankers are managing the near-term economic and financial ramifications of COVID and hopefully the exit from COVID, and I'm sure they'll manage that well. But they also have the responsibility and the capability of doing more than one thing at one time, and that responsibility and capability is making sure the financial system is well placed to address medium and longer term risks. And when it comes from an economic perspective, and when you look at the enduring economic impact of climate change, and I'll just refer to you to those NGFS scenarios, which just came out, there are IMF work and others. Look, climate change is a much bigger economic impact and a much more enduring economic impact on the global economy, particularly in Asia, than COVID is. And climate change is an issue we can do something about in advance. I mean, we all wish we had done something about COVID in advance. So I respect that comment, if I can put it that way.
Just keep drilling down into the application at the national level. There's this nationally determined contributions that each country has to make. Now, many countries will have conflicts between, continued growth and then the transition, as you mentioned. China, especially, has made very bold contributions. At the Global Climate Summit, they committed to peak emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. But on the ground, bank lending to coal-intensive industries still continues. How are countries like China and perhaps several countries have this same problem? How are they making that transition?
Every country will undergo a structural transformation. And so there are many industries and activities. Virtually everyone has to change in some ways. Some will find it easier, others much more difficult. There is no long-term future for coal. I mean, that's the bottom line. And it's a question of the time frame for phasing it out. The sooner we phase it out, the better. But there, in some countries that's a bigger challenge than others. I recognize that. But there is no long-term future for coal. We cannot come close to our climate objectives if we burn all the coal that's in the ground. It's very simple math. The readership and the viewership of the Asian Banker can handle that math. The second is that China, very important series of commitments that they have made by their choice. The first is the macro commitment, the 2060-2030 commitment, but then also President Xi at the Biden summit observed a sort of peaking in activity for coal in 2025, and then a beginning of phasing down. That wasn't overly specific, so I don't want to read too much into it, but again, consistent with the transition. And of course, one recognizes that China's level of industrialization and activity, there's a time frame for that transition. But of course, when your question was originally motivated on economic growth, when you also turn it around in terms of the growth opportunities for China in the future, at the present and the future. I mean, this is a country that is the world's largest solar producer. It's the world's largest zero-emission vehicle producer. It rightly has very strong ambitions, intentions in a range of industries that are the industries of the future, the exports of the future, the growth creators of the future, which happen to be parallel to also helping to address climate change. So I think the economics actually stack up pretty well.
The BIS had its meeting, and the BIS entire dialogue on climate change involves a lot to do with bond purchasing and monetary policy. How is the BIS evolving? And how are they onboarding the measurements that you talk about and the commitment levels? Just a shorthand way of asking this question is: will we see a Basel IV that has climate commitments worked into it somewhere?
There's a few things. One is I distinguish the Basel Committee, which of course is a committee of central banks and supervisors, which is looking at and has said that they will they are doing a comprehensive review of their facilities and their supervisory practices related to climate risk, which is very welcome. The Financial Stability Board is also doing the same and due to report to the G20 in July, actually, on its assessment of the issues and what the forward agenda will be. So very active there. And then thirdly, what you're seeing is less from the BIS itself's perspective, but by member central banks, most notably the Bank of England and the ECB. But there are others who are looking at this, is to examine their facilities, their central bank monetary operations, and saying, okay, how consistent are those with climate change? In other words, corporate bond purchases, what types of bonds are favored versus others? And the Bank of England is consulting on this at the moment. And there will likely be a tilt, this is their words, towards those companies that have a plan to reduce their emissions. Now, that even though they own only about 6% of that bond market, given the collateral ramifications and others, is likely to have a significant impact over time. But of course, from their perspective and the system's perspective, it's managing a risk accordingly.
In addition to talking with you, I actually talked with a number of CEOs of banks, across Asia, at least, and they've already started reporting, green finance, what percentage of their assets are, carbon neutral and so on. You get this feeling that they're just greening their books for the moment. Is there a transition phase where some of this is actually, window dressing, and then it becomes real at some point?
I might put it a little differently. There may be a learning curve and an initial development of the expertise that institutions go through, and that's natural. It starts with more niche products and I mean, green bonds aren't necessarily a niche product. They're quite widespread now, but they're not mainstream finance. Your question brings out a very important point. We are not going to get to net zero with specialized niche green products alone, as valuable as they are. This has to be part of mainstream finance. And so let me put it in context, which is that also what happened at President Biden's summit in April, apart from President Xi's comments and some other commitments other countries made, is that we formed an alliance of major banks, insurers, pension funds, and others, asset managers, with balance sheets of $70 trillion. So huge is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And their commitment is not about a portion of their assets going into green, but it's about managing towards net zero, and not just in 2050, but with interim targets in 2030 and 2025, and then specific strategies that they determine all of this for specific sectors. So the heart of the system is moving towards managing the entire balance sheet in the direction of net zero. Critical point here, though, is that part of what they do is they finance a steel company, a cement company, an auto manufacturer, and even an energy company that is making investments to reduce their emissions. And this is the key thing. We want capital to flow to companies that have a plan to reduce emissions. We don't want it just to flow to the end state, to the green. We can't move overnight to only funding renewables. It would be wonderful if we could, but we can't. And so the important thing is that capital will move to those companies that, as I say, have a plan. It is very capital intensive to move this way. It's one of the reasons why there is a huge GDP and job multiplier effect of the transition.
The fund managers are very good at telling a story of the profitability of assets that are invested in diversity and impact investments and so on. Is there a profit motivation that the banks are looking for? A story that they can tell?
Well, it's more than a story. This is an enormous commercial opportunity. I can tell you the downside story. It is going to be increasingly expensive to own assets that are carbon uncompetitive. There will be, regulatory moves. There will be carbon prices. There could be potential trade moves. Companies that are not moving to reduce their carbon footprint will become more and more uncompetitive. On the other hand, companies and activities that are reducing carbon, reducing the risk to the climate, that's creating tremendous value. There's various ways I can draw out the commercial opportunity, but one of them is just to point to the scale of investment that's required. So it's on the order of a doubling of energy infrastructure investment every year. So going from roughly a little more than $2 trillion a year to around $4 trillion. The IEA, International Energy Agency, estimates $5 trillion a year. Now, 50% of that will be in Asia. So there's enormous investment opportunity. The bulk of it is in Asia, as it is with many things. And of course, financing that, investing in that will bring profit. It will be done on a profitable basis.
And how many countries will that need to be subsidized in some form or another? In other words, it's not just commercial bank lending, but subsidies.
The biggest subsidy right now is to the energy sector, which is producing this enormous externality, which is causing, very large scale climate risk and extrapolating climate risks. Again, estimates level impact on GDP by mid-century is something on the order of 10% globally. So that's a pretty large subsidy that exists right now today for the energy industry from not properly pricing carbon. First point. Second point is that the cost competitiveness of renewables. I mean, this is economic. This is more competitive than new generation, new coal generation, new gas generation. Now we need to make further advances in battery storage and others when we get to scale, huge scale, large proportion of grid. Confident that those will come. So where the questions around supportive policies come is more towards hydrogen, which is close to being economic, but not yet economic on the so-called blue hydrogen, around green hydrogen, around elements of carbon capture, sustainable aviation fuel, those areas where that's where the concentration, but the core of renewables and increasingly in zero emission transport, it is economic and cost competitive today, which is why the commercial opportunity immediately is so attractive.
Something that I noticed in high growth countries is that when you put on more regulation, you inadvertently create a kind of a shadow banking system or so. And you get a lot of the financing, sort of seeping through other forms, other channels, especially to small businesses and businesses that have difficulty getting credit. And I think that's more in developing countries than in developed countries. What are some of the concerns that maybe central bankers might have told you, or that you are aware of too much regulation, or of the idea of some new form of side financing platform evolving as a result of this emphasis on climate change?
A, it's a disclosure issue. B, it's the extent of the breadth of commitment to a climate pathway consistent with net zero. So let me be more specific. So the extent to which that financing is coming from, shadow banking, which is a very broad term, but often captures alternative investors, shall we say, so private equity, hedge funds, others. Well, most of the funding of alternative investors, or much of it, comes from asset owners, so pension funds, life insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds in some cases. I mean, the question is being asked of those pools of capital, well, are you going to align with net zero if you're in a country that itself is aligned to net zero? Now, once you have made that decision, then your desire and the appropriateness of financing someone in the shadow banking who's actively moving against that goes away. Secondly, most of the shadow banking sector operates on leverage. A lot of that leverage is tied ultimately back to the banking sector, which is why there is 30 odd trillion of assets in the banking sector that is committed now to net zero through this Glasgow Alliance. Now we're going to look to grow that and transition appropriately. But we have to be conscious of these risks, as we always do. We will start with those advantages. And the last point I guess I'll make, Emmanuel, from my time as a regulator, long time as a regulator and as a banker, it is the responsibility of the authorities to know what's going on. There needs to be light in the shadows. We need to know what's going on. Then decisions can be made, and by appropriate authorities, whether there's comfort with that.
I only asked this question because I've seen it happen, in different iterations before. And capital markets for carbon trading, capital markets for infrastructure, for long-term projects. How's that evolving? What would you like to see happen?
Well, first is, I said at the outset, there were a few missing markets, or maybe underdeveloped markets. So one of those is the market for carbon offsets. So, and just to be clear, what we're talking about is private purchasers, companies that have committed to net zero. Take the example of Microsoft, which is committed to make up for all the emissions that ever happened since Bill Gates founded it in Albuquerque. Well, the only way it can do that is to offset carbon. It has to purchase or invest in new forests or in some form of removal of carbon from the atmosphere. That market, there are examples of trades and investments that way, but as a market, it doesn't properly exist. Now, this is it's $100 billion a year market is our estimate within a few years, accounting for about 10% of reduction. We're working hard to develop that market. I expect that there will be a very important Asian hub for that market potentially. There are those who are interested in hosting it. Maybe I shouldn't tip my hand on it. That's one market. Another market that's exceptionally important when you look at Asia more broadly is a market for blended finance. So a market where project finance, with some of the risks assumed by either multilateral development banks or governments, that then leverages private capital at scale.
Basically, you want to see depth, liquidity, and you want to see instruments being created. And it's been a while since carbon trading could have been developed much further, but I think it's moved very slowly. And basically, also in addition to government subsidy, to see aid being directed more accurately and more generously to the least developing countries. I think that's an area that there seem to be some issues. I'm seeing some numbers that are that could be much better than it is right now. So basically, depth and liquidity, a market that takes into consideration that this is a long-term type of instrument, and not just corporates being able to offset, but it becomes a market in its own right. Which do you think are countries that are likely to create markets, and what are the ingredients that you think a green finance market?
Well, there's many aspects of green finance, and I think in the major jurisdictions, major countries, China, India, others, there will be local currency, and these are already developed, and those will continue to grow. So local currency, green bonds, green loan markets will develop. I also think that on the carbon offset side, what's likely to happen with that market is that there's a core exchange traded contract, which is a reference contract for what is ultimately going to be a large over-the-counter derivative market. And the nature of those markets is there's some concentration, but they can be traded more broadly. I'd stress that the scale of the investment, the change in investment, 2 trillion potentially on some estimates per annum, which is a very large number, the bulk of which is in Asia, is such that it really becomes about that moving into the mainstream financing markets over the medium longer term, so that it's financing. Of course, there is a reference and there's an architecture and a reporting that both for companies and financial institutions about the extent to which they are aligned with net zero, the extent to which their portfolios are moving in that direction. But they're basically financing in mainstream markets, and that information will be available. They'll be able to make these calculations, these assessments, and do what they do best, which is pick the companies they want to back, either with lending or investing.
The conversation is, going in the right direction. It's a long haul. I just want to transition into another topic where you've provided leadership, cryptocurrencies, and I want to transition it by connecting it first to climate change and the concern that cryptocurrencies use a lot of electricity. What if cryptocurrencies did not use non-renewable energy sources? If the electricity that was used was from dams and renewable sources, would that make a difference to your perception?
Well, it would make a difference to the climate because the orders of magnitude of the power consumption of Bitcoin, for example, is remarkable in a bad way, given the relative contribution of Bitcoin to the functioning of the economy. It's not a currency. It's not aiding with the processing of the economy. It's a vehicle for investment and speculation and ransomware and other applications. I think the question is in terms of use of renewables and ultimate use of renewables for cryptocurrencies. Is what's the opportunity cost of that? In other words, we've been talking about the scale of investment that's required in order to transition. It has nothing to do with cryptocurrencies, the scale, that $2 trillion. There is more than enough demand for this type of investment and need for this type of investment, solar, wind, hydrogen ultimately, and others, in order to drive the economics of this, in order to drive the returns. We don't need, another use that cannibalizes some of that. I will observe, though, that as you well know, and your readership certainly will, is that not all cryptocurrencies are created equally in terms of energy consumption. In fact, Bitcoin in many respects is an outlier, and the incentives are very strong to reduce the energy consumption of them. And I will also note that distributed ledger technology has many applications, and some of those applications are quite interesting with respect to climate. For example, tracking carbon offsets. These are markets that need to have integrity and the traceability of an offset, is important for the integrity. And there's various ways to do that. There's companies working on this through distributed ledger technology, which also would have the benefit of efficiency and sort of straight through processing for transactions as well. So in the extreme case of Bitcoin and energy, I don't see it, but as you move to other applications, there are some potentially quite interesting I'll call them fintech, broader fintech solutions.
No, actually, the real value in cryptocurrency is that anyone can design and issue one. It's not just the fact that there are lots of cryptocurrencies that are generating a lot of capital in themselves, but that you can have 1,000 cryptocurrencies if you wanted to, and that changes the nature of what we mean by money, and a form of exchange.
There's a period of innovation, and then it will settle down at some point. And you get creation of private money when there's a gap in the payment system, basically. And so, what gap is being filled? Is it a gap for illicit activity? Well, that's not a very good, we don't want that. Is it a gap because there's an inefficiency in the way this financial system is organized? For example, in some of the settlement for wholesale financial transactions, that's true. And there's applications there. Is it a gap related to carbon that could be filled? So anyone can create one. But as Hyman Minsky said, anyone can create money. The trick is to get it accepted. Ultimately, having these monies accepted is going to be for the use case of the money and how effectively it does it. And then the judgment in the fullness of time will be, well, is that better done with private money, or will public central bank digital currency, public money, ultimately crowd it out? And I can see both coexisting side by side, some private with public because of these use cases. But the bar is relatively high for those. I certainly do not see that the core use case, day-to-day transactions, will be private money at its center. I don't mean inside money creation. I mean, there will be a central bank digital currency at the center of the system, in my view.
In fact, a lot of what you've just said are reflected in the Bank of England's working papers.
That's good. I feel reassured by that.
Central bank digital currencies, you tend to focus a lot on the wholesale side of central bank digital currencies. There are countries that are deploying them at a retail level. What should they be? What are the elements of a good central bank digital currency in your view?
We have a system today in virtually all our economies where the vast majority of money is created by the private sector. It's, bank makes a loan, it's creating money, it has to have capital in order to make that loan, but that's a system, and that's a system that works quite well. The public doesn't realize it, by and large. They think money is money, and that's a good thing. And part of our job as central banks is to make sure that confidence is maintained. I don't see a reason to change that system such that the central bank crowds out the private banking side. In fact, I see lots of reasons not to change that system, but to at the same time to move to a system that has the benefits of a programmable currency, the true elements, if you will, of digitization. And so that's why I tend to be more on a two-tiered system, wholesale being the central bank digital currency, so that they're, the instantaneous settlement is at the level of the central bank, but for many more players than public accounts, in effect, directly with the central bank, either on an account basis or tokenized basis. That's where I think that the most robust and competitive system will be, and competition in a good sense of private financial institutions trying to provide better service.
Insofar as central bank digital currency is basically electronic money, you could hijack an existing digital wallet and call it central bank. The account is maintained at the central bank rather than in a private platform or a commercial technology company. And also this thing called token. I've been reading the papers issued by different central banks. They are actually far more rudimentary than imagined. And to a large extent, this whole idea of token is not the same as a crypto token, which is blockchain centric. It's basically being able to deploy money offline when it's needed. And also on the wholesale side, the countries that are interested in internationalizing their digital currency, they don't want to give things away. The whole idea is it's attractive is because you're able to lend in your currency offshore, without losing control of who's borrowing it and so on. So there's a kind of a philosophical divergence between the countries that are liberal and open and the countries that are actually, going into CBDCs with a very control mindset in view. Do you see that difference, or do you have a certain philosophy about what it should be?
Well, I think there's a difference in philosophy at present, and has existed for some time in countries that are more susceptible to balance of payments pressures. For example, given size, circumstance, relative risk profile, and one can expect that would persist. And one of the challenges with moving to a system of central bank digital currencies is potentially that currency competition becomes much easier or much more fierce, and the ability to shift becomes much more seamless, and therefore there's greater pressure on those countries. So what you're seeing, I think, is a manifestation of that, of trying to think about ways to limit those risks, and there are mechanisms to do that, and I think those central banks will pursue those.
You would be more liberal about allowing stable coins into your ecosystem, your central bank.
I mean, yes and no. That form of money is just prone to debasement, I think, in the fullness of time. The type of perspective you need to have as a central banker or an authority that's measured in decades, as opposed to a 5-year business plan. Recognize that the only way to have at scale, at the core of the system. I'm interpreting your question in terms of being at the core of the system, as opposed to being a native currency for some specific application. Okay. That I can see stablecoin in it.
I imagine
at the core of the system, it's too much of a risk. And the only way to eliminate that risk is to back the stablecoin with the central bank balance sheet 1-to-1. So you have, no gap, no maturity mismatch. But if you do that, why would you do that with a private stablecoin? it's the public. You've given the public balance sheet away, so why wouldn't you do it with just manage it yourself? And the answer is you would manage it yourself.
Well, that's what the central bank would want to do.
If I'm a central bank, it's my balance sheet. So the only person whose opinion matters in that conversation is the central bank. So
having the same conversation with some of the crypto guys out there, they're out to tear down the central bank system. So not necessarily in the UK or somewhere. You now have stable coins that are going into the billions of dollars, and Bitcoin going into $1 trillion. So these are sizable sums now. So it's just a question of at which time will there be a rapprochement, sort of like a recognition that they play a certain value. And on top of that, some of these stable coins, they've got applications on them, right?
I said a while ago about those applications, filling gaps and specific gaps in the payment system. You can see having a private currency filling that role. That is distinct from tearing down the central bank, quote unquote, and being at the core of the system. That's not going to happen. So it's niche and it plays a role. But then you look at an asset and say, well, which of these crypto assets is actually transitioning towards playing that role, as opposed to representing that it's going to play the central role of as the medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value for an economy. And if you're gunning for that, well, good luck.
I'm totally neutral. Appreciating that you want to maintain the core. It's how you sort of allow the play for alternatives or supporting systems.
I think there will be some. Certainly will be allowed if it's a superior solution to specific payment applications.
In fact, there's this whole dimension of community currencies, which became quite popular in Africa during the COVID period. Small communities, tokenizing work and effort and so on. That might be a form of stable coin, as it were. But then again, they exist in closed systems rather than broadly accepted. In fact, in Kenya, for example, the central bank specifically disallows a community currency to be used broadly. I'm just curious how that will evolve over time, and your take on that. I didn't realize that you had written a book, Values. The book that is very popular in China is Ray Dalio's book Principles, and this thing about single titles and then and espousing values. I just got a hold of your book on Amazon, and so I've gone through the table of contents. I hope to read that. The big difference between your book and Ray Dalio's book is he's from a perspective of an entrepreneur, so he talks about work, his own personal background and stuff. Whereas you've started with the rise of the market society and the crisis of values in the banking crisis, and then you personalized it in your third chapter. Tell me a little bit more about the book.
It's about the relationship between value and values. So values of society, what values do we need for the market to function effectively? And we saw the challenges we have, and I lived through them as a central banker and the global financial crisis, when they can go wrong. But also what we were just talking about earlier, which is if society values something like getting to net zero, addressing climate change, if that is something we value, then the most powerful mechanism to deliver that is the market. So value serves values, and that dynamic is what's playing out, and that's how you turn a major risk into a major opportunity. And also what we were touching on, and the book goes through this in some detail, is about, well, how do we measure value, and what gives money its value, and therefore what is the future of money? What's the history of money? Where has it gone wrong? We talked about stable coins earlier. The Bank of Amsterdam was a stable coin for much of the 1600s, until it succumbed to the temptation to run a mismatch and start to lend. which is what happens when it's circumstances, and then the core of the system fell apart. A private institution made those decisions. The book looks at all of those aspects, and then looks to apply it to, well, how do I put that into action as a leader of an organization? How do I do it as an investor, similar to Ray? How do I do it if I'm running a business? And what are the implications for running a country? What are the public policies? So it draws on the lessons of crises and the history of money, and then applies them. Leader, company, investor, country.
When you talk about crisis of value, leaders have to make decisions that are counter to everything that's been told to them at that point in time. And for us, the 1997 Asian financial crisis was a crisis of values, and you had countries like Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand having to make important decisions, and at that time the prevailing values of the IMF and the and the Western world order was allow your banks to fail, and float your currency, and so it's the countries that went against that grain that eventually were able to hold a sustainable level of their own economies, and ride that through. So to what extent do you speak about the values of someone being able to stand up against conventional wisdom in a crisis?
Well, that's the first thing. I would say that that advice, which was wrong in most cases from the IMF, and I think history has proven that out, those were policies, not values. When you think about sustainability as a value, it's not just about environmental sustainability. We touched on this earlier. It's also economic sustainability. In other words, I can't solve climate change if I'm going to throw large parts of my population out of work. I need to determine the way to reduce my emissions and grow my economy. That needs to be sustainable in all those senses. I need, in a financial crisis, a sense of solidarity. So the adjustment needs to be borne fairly across the economy in order for that to work. The gold standard, and I go through this in the book, part of the reason why the gold standard failed is that it put increasingly the weight of adjustment on workers in service of international stability. Well, that was getting the balance wrong. And but if you have a sense of your core values of sustainability, responsibility, and a necessary respect for dynamism in the market, which is a value I believe is at the heart of all this, then you see these issues more broadly, and you're more likely to make the right decisions, and that's why it's so essential.
I asked you why you wrote a book in that form, values, rather than something about your job as a central banker or something like that, because at the heart of capitalism is consumption, it's leverage. Do you take a shot at that? Do you say that capitalism is broken?
No, not at all. But well, first thing, why did I write it? It does draw on my experience. I mean, look, I'm G7 central bank governor during the global financial crisis, the Euro crisis, the Brexit crisis, the climate crisis, the COVID crisis. I've been at the heart of a series of these, and you draw, you lessons from experience. These are some of my lessons from experience about how we get the balance right between the values that are necessary for the market to function and how we put the market in service. But the market is incredibly powerful. I'm very much a believer in the market, and seen its power, and always operated at the intersection of markets and public policy. So this is how you get the market to serve society, and create tremendous value and economic opportunity for people along the way. The father of capitalism is often described as Adam Smith. People buy but don't read The Wealth of Nations. They remember the invisible hand. It appears once in the book. What they don't buy is moral sentiments, which is his greater work. And his whole point is that you need those moral sentiments, those values, in order to support a well-functioning market. And if you don't buy that book and understand it, then the first book is misread, and it undercuts itself. And that's the balance we have to get. I learned that through my experience as a governor and in the private sector where I was before. And so what I've tried to do is to distill that into some experiences and lessons. Yeah.
But how far are you from Adam Smith in terms of the need for regulation, the need for government, in a market environment?
All markets are social conventions. They don't exist in a vacuum. They need some structure around markets. Some of that is regulatory. Some of that is the customs that are associated with those markets, which in that regard, I'm very much like Smith. That's exactly what Smith believes and experienced. And he was very much a student of markets and understood different types of markets, including markets that didn't work well in his time.
Well, I look forward to reading the book, and drawing from your personal experiences as well as the lessons that you're putting out on values. Thank you very much for spending time with me. And hope that we will be able to meet sometime, and we will try and promote your book here in Asia, and we'll make sure that it gets a good read. I've already downloaded it on my Amazon, so I'm going to read that shortly. Thank you very much, Mark.
Excellent. A real pleasure, Manu. I'm sure we will meet at some point. I look forward to being out there, and I'll see you in Singapore, hopefully.